Hello and welcome to our 7th lesson in this module on data manipulation and navigation. This time around we're going to be going through another very important feature in Excel that you're going to be using all the time. Not so much when you manipulate data necessarily, as we have with our sales rep data over here in the order data, but definitely when you're going through financial models, it's something that's going to come up all the time when you have financial statements like this and you're calculating ratios and different metrics. And that is what is known as anchoring cells and using absolute versus relative references. So the easiest way to illustrate this is to get started with an example and just go through something very simple in this file first, and then we'll move over to our financial model over here and I'll show you some practical applications of how you might actually apply this and also how we can use what we're going to learn in this lesson to fill in our formula for the provision for income taxes for Walmart in future years here. So let's start with what is an absolute versus relative reference. Well, to do this, let's enter some very simple numbers and formulas just to illustrate the concept. So I'm going to enter 1, 2, 3, and I'm pressing tab each time to accept the changes and move over, 4 and 5. And now let's just enter an equal sign, go up with the arrow keys and say 1, we'll enter the asterisk sign, shift 8 for multiplication, 1 times 2, and we have that. Now, if you press F2 right now or Control U on the Mac to enter the cell, you can see what we have there. And what we can now do is use some of the shortcut keys we learned in the previous lessons to actually copy and paste this formula over, or we could just copy and paste it as we normally would with Control C and Control V or Command C and Command V on the Mac. So let's do that. Press Control C and then Shift and the arrow keys to move it over, and then Control V to paste it. And this works exactly as you'd expect because we're using relative references. What that means is that when we have a formula like this, the M10 times the N10, every time we copy it over one column, the columns here shift over. So now we're at N and then 0, and then we're at O and P, and then finally we end up at P and Q. So that's what a relative reference is. If we copy this down, let's see what happens. Well, we press Control C, Control V, and now it goes to 0 because our row has moved down as well. So with relative references, just enter this. Relative references, copy formula over or down, and references in formula also change. But you might have scenarios where you don't want this to happen, where maybe instead of multiplying everything and shifting this over each time, maybe you want that to happen only for the first one, but then for the rest of these, you actually want to multiply by 2 each time for some reason. Now, in this case, it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense because this is just sample numerical data, but let's just change this around and then see what happens. So I'm going to highlight everything with Shift Control right arrow key and then press the delete key to get rid of those. Now let's try doing this with absolute references to see what the difference is. So I'll press the equals key and then I'll go up to cell N10 with the arrow keys. Now to enter this as an absolute reference, I can press F4 or Command T on the Mac, and now we get these dollar signs right in front of this. So right in front of the N and right in front of the T, we have dollar signs now. Now these don't actually correspond to the currency dollars. What it really means is that now when we copy this formula and let's say we multiply by something else here. Let's say we copy by the O10 cell. Now if you're wondering how I did that, let me show you really quickly. So if I have it like this, now if you enter the asterisk sign and you try to then go out of the cell, you may not be able to. If you get stuck, you can just press F2 to go back into edit mode or to go out of edit mode to be able to go around like I am right now. So I've done that and I've used the arrow keys to go up here to go to cell O10. And now let's see what happens when we copy this. Control C, Shift arrow keys, and then Control V. Well, we can see by pressing F2 or Control U to go into the cell that now the N10 has stayed the same even though we've copied this around, but the second part of the formula, the O10 that was originally here, is now shifted to P10, and then here, same idea, now it's shifted to Q10. So that's the difference between absolute and relative references. So with absolute references, copy formula over or down, and references in formula do not change. So you could see, going back to our financial model, exactly how this would be helpful in that context, because in some cases, such as if we're multiplying the cost or dividing the cost of revenue by revenue, well, if we copy this across, yeah, we definitely want the columns here to change. We want to get a new number each year. On the other hand, let's say that we have the company's tax rate, effective tax rate, 32%. Well, when we multiply by their pre-tax income, by their taxable income each year, we don't want this 32% tax rate to be shifting around at all. So this is a case where we'd use an absolute reference instead. Now, in addition to that and using an absolute reference versus a total relative reference, there's also something in between. And I don't know if there's an official name for this in Excel, but I'll show you what it is. And to do this, I'm actually going to enter some additional data here. I'm going to press Control X after pressing Shift Control right arrow key. So Control X and then Control V to copy, to cut actually and paste this down. And I'm just going to enter some more data on this row to illustrate this feature. So in addition to what I just showed you, you can also choose to anchor just the row or just the column as part of an entry, a part of a cell reference in a formula. So let's take a look at how this works. So let's say that we have the 2 here once again, and we want to multiply. Actually, let's go over one more. Let's say that we have the 2 here. We want to take this and then keep the 2 the same in this row whenever we multiply, but then change it to the 6 when we move down. How do we do that? Well, we press F4 once, and that gets us to anchor both the row and the column part, so we lock these and they don't shift around at all. Then we press it again, and now the 10 part, the row there, is anchored, but the column will shift around. And then if we press F4 again, now the n part, so that particular column is anchored, but the row will be allowed to shift around. So we have that. Let's copy this across and see what happens. So Control C and then Shift arrow keys, Control V. And actually I should have entered something else in the formula here. So I'll press F2 to enter it, multiplication sign, and then press F2 to go into edit mode and use the arrow keys to go up, multiply by that, and then Shift Control right arrow key to copy this across, and then Control V. So if you press F2 or Control U on the Mac to go in and look at these, you can see that basically the column is staying the same each time in the first part of the formula, but then the second part is changing. Now, the interesting part here, and I'm going to copy these down so you can see this better. The interesting thing is what happens if we copy this down by one row. So let's see. Copy this down. And look at this. Now our row has been allowed to shift, but our column is still staying the same. So let's copy this with Control C, Shift right arrow key, Control V. Once again, you can see that our column for the end part is staying the same, but then our row is moving down whenever we copy this somewhere new. So you can anchor both the row and the column when you're referring to a cell in a formula, or just the row or just the column. So it's up to you, or you can just anchor nothing and have them move around. Now, the method you choose and the mode you're in when you're doing this really depends on what you're doing and what type of model or file you're modifying. For the most part, if you're just manipulating data like this, you're not going to use this feature a terrible amount, because if you're trying to find something like the total number of orders or the order dollar amount or something like that, that's going to change for each person or each order in the table. So it's not going to be terribly useful to use it here. However, if we go over to our financial model for Walmart instead, press Alt-Tab to go over here, you can see how it would be very useful in this case, because we can do a couple things. First off, when we have these formulas that have the cost of revenue as a percent of revenue, or even something like the gross margin over here, you can see that both of these are referring to the same revenue number here at the top. And then same for sales, general, and administrative expenses down here. So we have those, and then also even the EBITDA margin. Again, this is all these formulas basically have the revenue in the denominator here. So you press F2 to enter it, you can see that they're always including revenue as part of the denominator. So this is a prime case where we may want to use a partial absolute reference to make sure that the row here for revenue never shifts around. And then, as I mentioned before, this example with the taxes, well, this is another case where we want to probably use an absolute reference to refer to the effective tax rate and to use that to calculate Walmart's taxes for each year into the future. So what I want you to do for your exercise in this lesson is to do the following. For the cost of revenue, and I'll just highlight this cell, the cost of revenue, and actually let me modify that slightly. I'm going to highlight the exact areas that I want you to change around. We are actually just going to do this for the gross margin right here to make this a little bit simpler to set up. So we're going to do it for the gross margin. So the gross margin, and then the EBITDA margin, Shift F8, and then the EBIT margin, Shift F8. So for each of these, what I want you to do is to go in and change the formula so that the denominator, the row part there, does not shift around, and do that using these partial absolute references. And then after you're done with those three, what I want you to do is go in and calculate correctly the taxes for each year for Walmart. So fill in the percent of pre-tax income here by linking correctly to this effective tax rate cell up here at the top, and then make sure that your formula for the provision for income taxes is filled in correctly. The rest of these formulas will work, so that's really all you have to do here. So use a combination of absolute and relative references to do both of those, and then when you're done with that exercise, unpause this video, and then we'll go through it together and I'll show you the exact shortcuts. Okay, good. So here's what we can do to get started with this. First off, I'm going to use the Control and up arrow key to move over here to the top, and then the Control right arrow key to move over to the effective tax rate. So we can see where this is. This is cell L5. I can actually just use the mouse scroll wheel or the page up, page down keys to move around here. So we know where this cell is, but let's get started with some of the other tasks here first. So the gross margin, I can either use the arrow keys or just actually use the mouse to go down to this. And what I'm going to do here is change this cell F23. I can press F2 to enter the cell or Control U on the Mac. And then I want to get the cursor over in this portion for F23 and press F4 once. And then F4 again, or Command T on the Mac. And then you can see how the dollar sign's in front of the 23. That means that the row 23 here will not shift around as we copy this formula down, but the F part, the column part, will shift around, and then the top part for gross profit, that'll also shift around as we copy this formula around. So we have that, and what we can now do is press Control C, and then Shift Control right arrow key, and then Control V, and you can press F2 or Control U to go in and verify that so that's working correctly. And then the second part, what I asked you to do is to go down and do the same thing for the EBITDA margin and EBIT margins as well. So one approach you could take is to press F2 or Control U to enter the cell, and then do the same thing. Press F4 once, and then press F4 again to make sure that the 23 part is anchored and that doesn't shift around. But a smarter approach here would actually be to use the Control arrow keys to move up to gross margin, and then press Shift Control right arrow key, Control C to copy all these formulas, and then to go down here to EBITDA margin and press Control V, and then to go down to EBIT margin and then press Control V again. What does this do? How did it work? Well, remember, when we go up to this formula for gross margin, press F2 to go in, we can see that the F28 part, both of these are relative references, so these are both going to shift around. However, the 23 part will not. The F part here will shift around. So what that means is that the row for the revenue will never move, but the one directly above us, that will actually move as we copy this formula around. And you can see exactly how it works right here, that it's shifted all the way down to F48 in the beginning part, but then the 23 part of this formula has not moved at all because we have that dollar sign in front of it, because we've anchored that particular row. And then the same thing applies for the EBIT margin down here. So that's a slightly better way to do it. And now for the taxes, what we're going to do is for the percent pre-tax income, for this one, we're going to press the equal sign to enter a formula. and then we'll go up using the arrow key, control and arrow keys, and jump up to our effective tax rate over here. I'm going to press F4 or Command T on the Mac to anchor this completely, so we have two dollar signs, and then we can just copy this across by using Shift right arrow key and then Control V or Command V on the Mac. And I can press F2 or Control U and see that these are all linking to the correct formula. It hasn't shifted around all, which is exactly what we want. And then the provision for income taxes, we're just taking our taxable income times that tax rate, we're subtracting it to get to our net income, pressing F2 just to go into these cells and check them all, and so that's all working correctly. So these are a few common cases of where you might want to use absolute versus relative references, and as we go through this course, this will come up again and again, so you'll get a lot more practice with it, but for now, just keep in mind the concept and be thinking about some possible ways that you may want to use this to lock particular cell references and ensure that they don't shift around, or ensure that only parts of the cell reference don't shift around, or to ensure that the cells do actually shift around when you copy them. So get started thinking about that, and as you go through some of your own Excel files, look for ways you could use this and look for cases where it's going to come up. So that's our lesson on absolute versus relative references and anchoring cells. Coming up next, we'll be jumping into naming and jumping to important cells and models. And then after that, we'll be concluding this module with some work on workbooks and worksheets and copying, moving, deleting, and otherwise manipulating them.